everybody. I'm very excited to share my presentation today titled How Can Science and Photography Work Together to Advance Conservation in Canada? I'd like to start today by acknowledging that I currently sit on the unsurrendered and unceded traditional territory of the peoples of the Wabanaki Confederacy, and that the work I share in this presentation comes from the lands and waters across Turtle Island. I mention this to acknowledge the historical and ongoing colonial forces of oppression that continue to shape our institutions, and to contextualize my personal relationship with these ongoing projects and my research. I'm deeply grateful to have spent time working and living across this land, and attribute my ongoing commitment to ecological and social justice in part to the privileged opportunities I've had to spend time enjoying wild places. Going forward with this project and others, I'm committed to adopting interdisciplinary and inclusive science and science communication with the distinct intention of creating human-environment relationships grounded in ecological and social justice, equity, and sustainability. And in particular on this slide, I share this image because it depicts Mount Assiniboine in the Rockies in Western Canada. And this image is right along the Continental Divide, which splits our eastern and western watersheds of our continent. And I think it's especially appropriate because in this talk I'll be sharing images from across this continent. To start, for an introduction, my name is Liam, and I spend my time researching, photographing, and advocating for wildlife and their ecosystems across Canada. I grew up in Ottawa, Ontario, where I spent a lot of my time in the backyard and the forest with species like this barred owl, and I attribute my interactions with species like this owl as sort of sparking my initial interest in the natural world. In pursuit of this interest, I started my undergraduate studies on the West Coast, where I was fortunate to take part in a number of different terrestrial ecology or mammal coexistence projects. That's up in the top right-hand corner. And I'm currently out east for my master's study, where I'm investigating the impact of climate-driven regime shifts on the Bay of Fundy, with particular focus on the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale. Throughout my experiences in conservation, I've maintained and developed a strong interest and passion for photography and the ways in which all these disciplines can work together. This passion brings me to this talk today, which I'm really excited to present, so let's dive in. So I'm going to start with an image I created of undergraduate students while I was working as a TA. They're working in the field to collect fish with a seine net. And in my view, it's images like these that are important and often undervalued elements of conservation strategies in Canada. So I hope in this talk we can explore the overlapping disciplines of photography, science, and conservation, and kind of build an understanding of how all of these things can work together to better service conservation. For our outline today, I'm going to walk through general definitions of conservation, science, communication, and photography. And then I'll work through a couple of case studies, drawing from my personal work, which can help tease apart these differences, and I'll summarize with some final thoughts. So what is conservation anyways? It can be conceptualized generally as the preservation, protection, and or restoration of the natural environment and its wildlife. And there's a couple objectives that might be involved with conservation, at least simplified objectives. The first one might be to determine the state of an ecosystem, so that might include some monitoring or collecting of data. And then with this data, you can kind of interpret it and try and understand how an ecosystem may be disturbed. And with this information collected and our interpretation developed, we might be able to develop strategies to mitigate disturbance and, if required, restore the ecosystem to a given state. I mentioned those are simplified objectives, and they're simplified because in practice, conservation is far messier and involves us, humans. And to account for our humanity, we can conceptualize conservation within this social model of conservation. I've included a flowchart here that has the ecosystem up at the top and these arrows that connect the general public, science and scientists, as well as decision makers. And it can be kind of useful to think about how we lay out all these different concepts in conservation. In this talk, I'm going to really be talking about communication and photography as the bridges or as the arrows in this flowchart, in this model of social conservation. And if we think about some examples about how different initiatives like community science or iNaturalist can fit within this model, I've included in red here these arrows. So something like iNaturalist helps connect the general public to the ecosystem, as well off as a bridge between the general public and scientists. An activism campaign might really just be focused on this bottom row here, kind of this connection between the public, science, and decision makers. Probably think about news media as a similar sort of connection of these bottom row of themes in the flowchart. And then science communication as a very kind of intentional link between the general public and science and decision makers. So what exactly is conservation science, and how is it different than science? Well, science might just be the general pursuit of new knowledge in a scientific field, but conservation science is generally very mission or crisis oriented. It wouldn't really exist if species weren't at risk of going extinct. And in general, conservation science will follow the general process of observation, inference, and model building, and then developing predictions. And when conservation is applied to decision making, it can lead to really successful interventions. So in the top right-hand corner, I've depicted a map of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where in the past, endangered whale species have been hit by large ships navigating these waters. In response to a mass mortality event of right whales, Transport Canada collaborated with scientists across eastern Canada to enact dynamic management of the area. And to make a long story short, the area is actively monitored for endangered whales now. Vessels need to follow a specific route and slow down in certain instances. And generally, this approach appears to have significantly reduced the rate of ship and whale collisions. And similarly, in the terrestrial field, we have these mitigation measures such as wildlife overpasses or wildlife underpasses and the associated fencing, which across the globe has already allowed there to be a great reduction in wildlife vehicle collisions where the fencing is installed. And these crossing structures, like here in Banff National Park, have been shown to allow for permeability or the connectivity of different wildlife species such as grizzly bear and wolverine. So if we have our conservation science working, what's the point of communicating in the first place? Well, science communication in fact makes for better science. There was a study that evaluated the impact of social media exposure on the number of citations a paper gets, and it generally found that the more that a paper is shared, the more it is cited, which for scientists is a good thing. But I also think in general, by interacting with the public, you can more sort of precisely align your science to be the most impactful by understanding what most people are feeling is important in a given moment. And in general, science communication is important because facts don't just necessarily change the minds of people. There's a number of different research studies that have shown that other elements, such as a person's values, their emotions, or experience, are often more important in swaying minds. And for example, there's been surveys of conservation managers that have shown that they're often a lot more likely to draw on common kind of heuristics, such as their intuition or their opinions, rather than direct scientific evidence. This all underlines the importance of communication because showing someone these facts on a page is not necessarily going to initiate change. So, large criticism of conservation is that the biodiversity crisis persists. And because the crisis persists, it's probably a good idea to really focus on how we communicate our conservation science. And this is reinforced by the idea that a lack of scientific information is not the major barrier to conservation. There's countless environmental initiatives that could already be underway, and it's not because there's not a brand new scientific study. It's more about the knowledge action gap. And we can kind of characterize this gap as the difference between what we know should happen as researchers and environmentalists and as conservationists, this gap between what we know should happen and what actually happens on the ground. And we attribute some of this difficulty to the fact that conservation is inevitably very multidisciplinary and kind of these so-called wicked problems. There's a lot of different interdisciplinary challenges involved, but hopefully we can conceptualize the communication in the conservation science world as a way of bridging this gap, as a way of trying to address some of these wicked problems. And inevitably, of course, multidisciplinary problems require multidisciplinary solutions, which I think in my mind is just logical. So in terms of what makes science communication particularly effective is when it includes careful messaging that has a coherent narrative as well. And it's important to consider the relevance of the media type for your particular audience, so that depending on what particular group you're trying to reach, maybe a pamphlet is more effective, maybe social media is more effective. Very context dependent on what might be the best strategy for a particular communication piece. And of course, communication can be more effective when it includes a strong emotional appeal. Moving now to exactly what photography is, I've included a black and white image here from Nunavut of this massive mountain range rising out of the ocean, just to kind of set the stage of what photography can be. And in this particular case, this isn't even just one image. This is a series of, I think, about 30 images I've stitched together to kind of create this sweeping view of a particular mountain range. And photography can be performed by nearly everyone. In this day and age, everyone has a phone, a cell phone, some sort of way to capture image on a sensor, and to me, that's photography. And just worth acknowledging that this photography can be in pursuit of a variety of different goals, not just conservation, of course. And it can generally just be thought of as a way to create art and to just document and witness certain phenomena on Earth. Or I guess not necessarily just on Earth. But generally, photographs can be used to generate interest and inspire social change. Think of historically, photojournalism practitioners and activists have taken single images of a particular human rights crisis or something, and that has garnered significant support for certain issues. If we think now about the interface between science and photography, I find it really fascinating that oftentimes they're kind of overlapping disciplines. In the top right-hand corner, I've included an image of a wildlife camera trap in Mount Robson, BC, and we were using the specific images from this motion-censored camera to develop an understanding about how human recreation may be influencing mammal populations in that particular provincial park. So again, the key sort of data in this project came in the form of a camera. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, I have an image of my coworker and friend Jill looking at zooplankton under a microscope, trying to get an understanding of how their calories and size and shape might be of interest to bigger animals like whales that might be eating them. So in both these cases, the sort of visual media formed the foundational part of the data collection in the scientific method. And I think in general, thinking like a scientist may improve your images if you're interested in sort of iterating and developing data and input to create more compelling images. And that for scientists, thinking like a photographer, thinking about the ways in which you can use visual media to convey a compelling message, in both cases, it might be a beneficial exercise. Now, if we specifically think about what conservation photography is, I'd like to start with this quote from a National Geographic photographer that reads, "The nature photograph shows a butterfly on a pretty flower. The conservation photograph shows the same thing, but with a bulldozer coming at it in the background." And I've included on this slide 2 of my own images of the same species, a snowy owl, just outside of Ottawa, Ontario. And on the left side, I have a nice image of a snowy owl sitting on the snow at sunset. And I took this image maybe 10 years ago now. And I like it. I mean, it's sunset, it's very nice, but it doesn't tell you anything about the particular context of the owl. This image could be taken anywhere in the world. And there's not so much of a story behind it. But on the right-hand side, this is a more recent image, also outside of Ottawa I took, of a snowy owl, very small in the frame, at the top of a hydro pole with these right red flash in front of it. And this red flash is the taillights of a vehicle going by. I created this sort of blur effect by using a long exposure, and to frame it, I kind of sat down in the ditch and waited for a car to pass to frame all these things at the same time. And at night, I had to be really careful about trying to keep the owl sharp while using a long exposure. But all this to say, in this image on the right, I've intentionally framed the owl in the context, in the conservation context, it faces in the winter. So I was particularly interested in showing kind of the road in this image, because when snowy owls migrate south each winter to southern Ontario, the US, and the prairies, when they spend their time here during the winter months in North America, they face a gauntlet of human threats. They often come into contact with human impacts for the first time if they're a juvenile owl. And in particular, the road and vehicle collisions is the leading cause of mortality for snowy owls, at least in southern Ontario when they come south. So in this way, I've framed a conservation issues in a single image rather than just have a nice image of a snowy owl on the snow, which I think helped kind of create this compare-contrast of the difference between what like a wildlife photograph and more an image that starts to think about conservation, like on the right. So put simply, conservation photography can be thought of as photography that empowers conservation. And it's the act of intentionally having an understanding of the conservation theme or an ongoing conservation issue and trying to put it into your image. And I think it's useful to kind of reframe taking a photo to making a photo. And by moving away from this notion of something that you take away from the environment to more of a thought of how can I manipulate my position and the framing of a particular scene to tell a story about conservation. So conservation photography can be especially effective because it condenses complex information and it can do so very quickly, and that it also can include strong emotional appeal. And it's often most effective when it's part of a broader strategy to reach a target audience. In my mind, conservation photography isn't just, it kind of begins once you've taken the photo, gone on the SD card, and put it onto the computer, and you start to leverage it or start to mobilize it in broader strategies and broader, issues, and having that image then engage with the target audience and invested audiences. At this point, we'll move on to the first case study of this talk, which is the Canadian Conservation Photographers Collective, a group that I'm a part of. And in general, our goal is to unite as photographers to promote education and engagement relating to conservation. So we are a registered Canadian nonprofit with about 20 volunteers and over 50 photographers from across Canada. And we all kind of have a experience engaging with a variety of different stakeholders and environmental interest groups, and have launched a series of successful campaigns and partnerships. And for example, we recently worked with the Wildlife Conservation Society and the Key Biodiversity Area Group to launch a photo contest, to work on a photo contest, and have been involved in a variety of successful campaigns. In general, we promote ethical photography practices, and we hope to kind of leverage the expertise of our members to deliver educational media. And within the social model of conservation, I think we can think of ourselves kind of working at the public science interface and maybe also the public ecosystem interface. Our next case study will be looking at community science in Canada, and community or citizen science is science that directly involves the general public. And it's really proliferated in the digital age. There's been over 293 million observations of living things on iNaturalist, for example. And what's really great about community science is that it generates knowledge in the form of data and observations, but it also stimulates participant learning. So if you're using an iNaturalist app, for example, and you're observing something like a plant, you immediately can get some sort of feedback of what you might be seeing, maybe its current range or its uses by society. And this kind of creates a positive feedback loop potentially, whereby you want to learn more, so you make more observations. The more observations you get, maybe the more you want to learn. So it's kind of building a more general base of ecological knowledge amongst people. And what's really cool is that it also involves civic participation. So by getting more people involved in the scientific method in a relatively low barrier way, you can hopefully sort of build better trust and understanding of the scientific method and some of our institutions by, sort of pulling back the curtain on how a lot of science can work. So the start of the process of community science often involves the collection of images or observations, often in the form of a smartphone, a camera, or in the case of eBird, where you're just submitting checklists, it kind of just has to be your eyes or maybe your ears. And crucially is that all these observations are sort of based in space and time. In the case of iNaturalist, it's important to ensure your images are geotagged so that you can specifically put that observation on a map. And what's really cool about this huge volume of data is that it's available open source to conservationists worldwide. So when you're doing an ecological study, a lot of the time you're going to work with data in a place like RStudio, and there's these packages like awk and RGBIF where you can immediately access this global database of information right from your sort of data processing software. And what's great is that there might be underrepresented scientists who might not have the biggest budget in the world who can access this information for free. And for this next part, I want to talk about my friend Justin. Justin recently defended his master's at the University of Carleton, or Carleton University, where he was a Weston Family Conservation Science Fellow. And what was really cool about his project is that he mobilized community science to model and predict the spread of invasive plants in eastern Canada. So he selected a number of kind of representative plant species, and he kind of simulated the different ways in which they might spread throughout eastern Canada, and included a series of covariates as well. But what is really cool about this project is that it not only used data from a wide variety of community scientists, but that it's directly involved with the Nature Conservancy of Canada's management plan for invasive species. So, if you were in Southern Ontario and submitted images of invasive species, it's quite possible that that information has already been mobilized by someone like Justin to better understand how invasive species might be spreading and might be negatively influencing certain ecosystems. So for the final case study, I'm going to talk about my master's research. Here I have an image from the field where we're pulling up our oceanographic instruments. And let's jump in. So as a little bit of background, the North Atlantic right whale is a large black baleen whale found in eastern Canada and the eastern seaboard of the United States. And they're large sort of filter feeders of zooplankton. Imagine they swim through the water column with their mouth wide open, sort of passively trying to find these really dense patches of food. And this kind of microscopic food, kind of like a whale shark, they feed in a similar way. And this animal is critically endangered. There's only about 380 individuals remaining. For my project, I'm interested in the Bay of Fundy. And I'm particularly interested in the Bay of Fundy because historically, it's supported large aggregations. Like over half of the population of this species used to spend its time in the summer and early fall foraging or eating these huge amounts of zooplankton, or we can just refer to it as food. And this food seems to be subject to something called climate scale regime shifts. Now, that's a big word, but to really simplify it, it's kind of the general state of the ecosystem that's influenced by these long-term climate patterns and different ocean currents, including the Gulf Stream, which I've included here in red, and the Labrador Current. But put really simply, I'm investigating sort of the habitat change through time and specific focus on the Bay of Fundy. In addition to my scientific work, I was really grateful to receive support from the Trebek Initiative to kind of support science communication on my project. And in general, the objective of the Trebek Initiative is to use the power of science, exploration, and education to illuminate and protect the wonder of the world. So the great thing about the Trebek Initiative is that they've just funded their first 50 projects, which is pretty impressive. And when I look at this image, I see 50 different people working as sort of the nodes of that social conservation model. These are a lot of people who work in between standard disciplines and I think are making important connections across this country. To back it up a little bit, the Trebek Initiative is a grant-making partnership between the National Geographic Society and the Royal Canadian Geographic Society, and their mandate is to ignite a passion to preserve across Canada. So they're only funding projects in Canada, and successful applicants have received funding, networking events, and mentorship opportunities to showcase their work. And yeah, I'm really grateful to be a part of this group. So specifically for my master's project, I'm thinking about including photography throughout the duration of it, trying to fit in, a nice moment while I'm doing field science as well. And I hope my images can explore narratives of climate change and ecological resilience. One of the major goals is to create a portfolio of conservation images, which then can be used for science communication. And I hope I can kind of bring together a variety of different disciplines and the different ways of thinking, such as through images and video and scientific figures, to create social media content and maybe printed content as well for sort of engaging storytelling. So I anticipate that the science and the photos will contribute to the public's understanding of climate change and conservation in the Bay of Fundy. And I'm working to kind of work within an interdisciplinary community of conservation and communication practitioners in the Bay of Fundy. So hopefully we can kind of continue this network beyond my master's. And I hope as well, once more to go back to the nodes of the social conservation model, that I'm kind of working in between some of these standard disciplines. And I'm going to share some of the background of this photo. This photo was used at the start of my talk, and it kind of just looks like a black nose swimming in water, covered in mud. It's kind of hard, maybe, to understand what's going on here. But this is an image of a female right whale, scientists named her 4191, and she's a regular in the Bay of Fundy. She was born in 2011 and doesn't quite have any calves yet. Usually these animals start reproducing around the age of 10, so potentially she's, for whatever reason, hasn't been able to produce a calf quite yet. But to back this up, this is an image of a right whale feeding at the surface. So there's likely an area of strong tidal upwelling where I took this image, where it's drawing the zooplankton into these dense patches. So that we assume that's what the right whale is eating here with its mouth wide open. And around it is a large number of red-necked phalaropes, these small migratory sandpipers that actually spend a lot of their life out on the open ocean. And they're also targeting the same species of zooplankton that's likely being brought up to the surface in this particular location. And what I think is particularly compelling about this image is that these are both endangered species, both feeding on this sort of ephemeral or passing group of zooplankton that would be highly concentrated in this area, and that they've now moved great distances. This right whale is likely somewhere along the southern seaboard of the United States. All of these phalaropes are probably wintering somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, like off the coast of Ecuador, and they were just here in this moment in 2025 in August to just feast on this abundance of food, and now they've moved on for these sort of vast migrations. And for my work, where I'm trying to understand the influence of climate on their food, I think it's especially interesting to think of these like these big aggregations of food in such a fine sort of space and time, and to think about the kind of long-term influence of climate on these great abundances of food and these aggregations of animals. So if I have some final thoughts, I think it is important to think about the social conservation, or think about this sort of wider world in which your work exists, and try and be strategic about where you position it. And it's important to find a local conservation issue and learn deeply about it. So this might include visualizing an image you think is particularly impactful before you even go in the field, doing some reading and trying to come up with an image that would help tell the story even before you leave your door. Or maybe after you've spent a lot of time in the field, you can spend some time reflecting or journaling about trying to kind of bring your thoughts together about exactly what the issue is and how your work could be most impactful. And oftentimes this means collaborating with other folks. Sometimes just a cold email to a researcher or a journalist can be really impactful in building a group of people that are interested in a particular issue. And of course, one of the important things is using your understanding of a particular topic or an issue to then build it into the photo. The whole point of this is to build a photo that goes beyond just a portrait of an animal and frames the animal in a larger sort of conservation context. And I've included this image here because I remember reading a study that tracked these sheer waters, this bird in this image. It tracked them across space and time and saw that their movements were predictive of where might be good foraging habitat for whales, like this humpback whale. So I had this study in mind, and I was just really fortunate to take this image, which I thought helped tell that story. So to summarize today, I think everybody's images could be of better service to conservation. And if we can move away from the extractive lens of taking an image to a more intentional act of making an image, I think we can all kind of explicitly create something that uniquely reflects our own views of the social and ecological dimensions of conservation. And I think each of us has an important story to tell, and that each of us can create images that can help create a connection or a bridge where there was previously none. Got a lot of people to thank. I've drawn on work from a variety of different places and a lot of different organizations, but particular thanks to the funders, my committee for my master's work, all the members of the Conservation Oceanography and Marine Technology Lab, as well as the Canadian Conservation Photographers Collective, the people who've helped me in the field, and Cassia Sylvia Young and Sarah Carling for illustrations and photos, and to the Wild Collab for the use of some of those graphics as well. So thank you so much. Feel free to get in touch, and yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Take care.